A black woman walks toward her private jet. After a long week of work, she's a renowned CEO, a pioneer in biotech, just trying to get home. But then everything changes. A TSA officer stops her, says her ID looks fake, humiliates her right there on the tarmac, beside the very jet she owns. What happens next? A federal agent shows up. Cameras roll. And within hours, the story explodes nationwide, sparking a reckoning that shakes the system to its core. Stay with me. This is a story you need to hear. Before we begin, comment below and let us know where in the world you're watching from today. And if you believe in dignity, justice, and standing your ground, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more stories that matter. It all started on what should have been just another quiet night at the airport. The hour was late, but injustice does not keep a schedule. Dr. Lenora Hartwell stepped out of the black SUV like someone born from the weight of history. Not from fame, not from family fortune, but from grit, the kind passed down like heirloom scars. She wore a long coat, not for fashion, but as armor, shielding her against a world that had always tried to cut her down to size. The tarmac was quiet, moonlight flickering off the wing of her private jet like a silent witness. The air was cold and clean, but it could not cleanse the stench of suspicion waiting just beyond the glow of the hangar lights. You must understand, this was not a woman trying to impress anyone. She had already done the impossible. She had made medicine for the people no one invested in. She had bought a plane not to flaunt wealth, but to fly faster toward the emergencies no one else would bother to fix. And yet, as she approached the checkpoint, the man in the TSA uniform didn't see any of that. He didn't see her degrees. He didn't see her late nights in the lab. He didn't see the lives her work had saved. He saw her skin. And that, to him, was enough to doubt everything else. ID, he said, flat and clipped, as if daring her to prove she belonged. Lenora handed him her passport and driver's license with a calm that had been forged in fire. But inside, something familiar stirred. Not afraid, she'd walked through too many doors that said "do not enter" for that. No, it was weariness. The kind that crawls into your bones when you realize that even at 40,000 feet, even with your name etched into patents and bank accounts, you are still just another question mark in someone else's story. The officer stared too long, flipped the ID once, then twice. His lips tightened. "Wait here," he muttered. On that old tune. Now, to those who have lived long enough to remember fire hoses and counter stools, this moment may feel too familiar. But let me be clear, this wasn't Alabama in 1962. This was New York in the middle of the night, in the year of our Lord 2025. And still, black skin in the wrong space at the wrong hour summoned the same suspicion it always had. It's not always a slur, or a shove, or a bullet. Sometimes racism wears a badge and a bored expression, and it hides behind protocol. But the effect is the same. It reminds you that in this country, dignity is never granted. It must be defended, even at your own doorstep. And so Lenora stood there, the hum of her jet behind her, the weight of history beside her, and a storm of challenges beginning to rise. This night had only just begun. The officer had taken her ID like it was a test she hadn't studied for, something he expected to be wrong. And as Lenora Hartwell waited in the stillness, the kind of silence that buzzes beneath the skin, she realized something she hadn't wanted to admit. This wasn't just a delay. This was a ritual. A second officer came, a younger woman, uncertain in her authority, but certain enough to stand behind the older man's suspicion. They whispered like children trying to describe a shadow, unsure of what they were looking at, but certain it didn't belong. You see, in America, when you are black and successful, they don't call it excellence. They call it unusual. And unusual, in the language of power, too often means unacceptable. Lenora wasn't new to the performance. She had done it before. In banks, at boardrooms, At charity galas where donors smiled too wide and asked too many questions not about her work, but her story, that word they always use when they really mean how did you get in here. So now, on the cold edge of a private runway, Lenora reached into her handbag and began the slow, humiliating work of proving she was real. Business cards, conference programs, an embossed letter of thanks from the World Health Forum, a company ID. She laid them out like a priest preparing the altar. Still, Officer Caldwell frowned. The younger one, Hill, her badge red, bit her lip, eyes flitting back and forth like she wasn't sure what side of the river she stood on. "This doesn't add up," Caldwell said. Lenora almost laughed. "What doesn't add up? That a black woman could build a company? Fly private? Speak in London on Monday and try to get home to LA by dawn?" What didn't add up was how many times she had done this before. Isaiah, standing near the SUV, stepped forward. Calm. Controlled. The way black men are trained to be when the air turns electric. "She's Dr. Lenora Hartwell," he said. "CEO of Hartwell Biosystems. We can call airport security to confirm if needed." Caldwell didn't look at him. Didn't even acknowledge his voice. "We'll decide what's needed," he said, eyes still locked on Lenora. And there it was. "We'll decide." Those two words carry the full weight of American contradiction. We'll decide what's valid. We'll decide what's real. We'll decide whether you are who you say you are. Not the documents. Not the plane. Not the facts. We will decide. And if your skin is too dark, your story too high, your success too clean, then maybe we decide you're dangerous. Now, let's not pretend this was a gun or a nightstick or a chokehold. This was more elegant, more insidious. This was bureaucracy dressed as judgment. This was racism wearing a clipboard. As the officers called for backup, Lenora felt the night press in. She stood there with the calm of someone who's walked through fire. But make no mistake, every second chipped away at her humanity. She remembered her father, who used to say, "They don't care what you've done. They care that you did it while black." And now, at the pinnacle of her success, she stood outside her own aircraft, her life's work questioned, her body once again made into a battleground. This wasn't about ID. This was about identity. And the war, quiet though it was, had already begun. They called it a routine check. A routine check that had now dragged into its third hour beneath the unforgiving floodlights of a tarmac built for the powerful, those for whom time bends and questions disappear. But tonight, it did not bend for her. It broke. Dr. Lenora Hartwell, born of a mother who scrubbed floors and a father who read newspapers out loud as if truth might shield his children, stood frozen in the night, under the watch of men who saw only danger where legacy stood. And oh, what a cruel thing it is to build something from nothing, only to be asked to prove, again and again, that you deserve to hold it. You see, racism in 2025 does not always scream. It whispers in uniforms, lingers in pauses, hides in policy. It does not say, "You do not belong." It says, "We just need a little more information." And the implication is always the same. You are the lie. Caldwell had now summoned 2 more TSA officers. One older, one younger. They circled like priests of suspicion. Lenora watched them with the poise of someone who had been told before, in boutiques, in elevators, in boardrooms, that her very presence was the disruption. "Your passport doesn't scan properly," one of them said. Lenora blinked. "Then run it again. Or better yet, check it against the State Department database." But that would be too easy. And racism, like ceremony, demands performance. So they brought out flashlights, held her passport to the sky like sacred text, murmured about inconsistencies while standing in front of her plane, with her name on the registration, while her pilot prepped for takeoff and her driver looked on helplessly. A glitch in the system, they said. But Lenora knew better. When systems glitch for Black people, it's never just a technical error. It's a trigger. The truth is, these men weren't confused. They were convinced. Convinced that a woman like her couldn't possibly have earned a jet, a company, a voice. convinced that excellence in black skin must come with a catch. And while they whispered, while they flipped pages and flashed lights and fiddled with radios, Lenora stood still, but inside, she was burning. Because this is what they don't teach you in school. The hardest part about being black and successful isn't getting there. It's being allowed to stay. It's having to answer the same damn questions every time you walk into a new room, a new gate, a new life. Who are you? Where are you going? Why are you here? It's the way suspicion clings to you even when you wear success like a crown. And so tonight, Lenora stood not just for herself, but for every soul whose dignity has ever been measured in disbelief. The engine of her plane continued to hum in the distance, power waiting to be claimed. But power, when it comes wrapped in brown skin, must wait longer. And she did wait, with her back straight and her rage quit. Because this wasn't just about her flight. It was about every flight she'd ever taken just to be seen as equal. There is a peculiar cruelty in being made to wait by men who believe they own time. Dr. Lenora Hartwell stood under the white-hot lights of the JFK tarmac, surrounded now by 5 TSA officers, each draped in authority, but emptied of reason. She was no longer a person to them. She had become a possibility, of fraud, of threat, of something that shouldn't be. And therein lies the lie this country keeps telling itself, that racism wears a hood or shouts a slur. No, the deeper violence is quieter, bureaucratic, and clean. It comes in the form of suspicion without provocation, detention without charge, and humiliation disguised as procedure. Caldwell stepped forward again, his face taut with a righteousness only ignorance can breed. "We'll need to detain you temporarily," he said. Detain. A word so swollen with history it can't be spoken without echo. From slave patrols to sidewalk stops, from colored counters to airport gates, detain has always meant we don't see you as free. Isaiah stepped forward, calm but burning. "You haven't read her rights. You have no cause." "We have authority," Caldwell barked. Authority. What a dangerous word in the wrong hands. Lenora turned her gaze toward the plane, still waiting, still hers. It stood like a promise in the dark, a promise that success could shield her from this. But success had no jurisdiction here. These men didn't answer to progress. They answered only to their prejudice and their fear. And in their fear, they forgot themselves. Because this wasn't just a black woman in a coat. This was a storm they didn't understand. But Lenora, she understood. She remembered her father telling her about the buses in Montgomery, how they would pretend your coin was counterfeit, how they'd close the door before you stepped up, and how that too was called procedure. She remembered the bank manager who asked her, twice, to explain how she made her money. She remembered the gallery owner who asked if she was with the caterers at her own fundraiser. And now she was remembering this cold night, this fake detainment, this line in the sand where silence was no longer an option. A sharp vibration broke her thoughts, her phone. Victoria, her attorney. "They can't do this," Victoria said, voice low but sharp as glass. "I'm contacting the TSA legal division." "You are not alone in this." Lenora nodded, though her body trembled, not from fear, but from the weight of having to carry so much grace in a space so graceless. Then a rumble in the distance. Not thunder, but headlights. A black sedan slid to a stop. The door opened and out stepped Joel Chambers, a black man in a crisp suit with calm fire in his eyes. "Miss Hartwell," he said. She blinked, almost disbelieving. "Yes, I'm from the TSA office of the Ombudsman. I'm here on behalf of the federal director." Caldwell bristled. His lips pressed into a line too proud to bend. Joel walked toward them, a man accustomed to navigating rooms where power listens only when it is dressed like it. "I've been briefed," Joel said, voice measured. "And unless you have verified evidence of fraud, this is no longer your call." Caldwell stood rigid, still trying to make the facts bend to his comfort. But Joel was not there for his comfort. He was there for justice. "We've already rescanned the passport," Joel continued. "The glitch has been corrected." Her documentation is valid. All of it. There was a silence then, a silence shaped like defeat. And at that moment, the authority in Caldwell's badge began to crack. But Lenora didn't smile. Because she knew this was not justice. This was merely an interruption. What she had suffered, what so many before her had suffered, was not error. It was designed. And though the doors might open tonight, the architecture of suspicion still stood tall. So she breathed deeply, stepped toward her plane, and with every footfall whispered to herself, "Not again. Never again." Truth in America, you see, often needs an audience before it is permitted to breathe. And so it was, just as Dr. Lenora Hartwell was gathering her documents with hands still cold from accusation, that the beam of another vehicle cut across the tarmac. Not another official, not a supervisor, but something far more unsettling to men like Officer Caldwell, a camera. Caden Farrell, a young reporter from the Daily Metro, stepped out with a mic in hand and a lens already recording. Behind him, a cameraman adjusted his focus, not on the jet, not on the sleek SUV, but on Lenora, standing tall in the midst of what should have been a private, silent humiliation. You must understand, these men had not expected light. They'd built their power on darkness, on back rooms, and buried apologies. They were not prepared to be seen. "Miss Hartwell," Caden asked gently, "can you tell us what's going on?" Lenora paused, glancing at Joel Chambers. He gave the smallest nod. "It's your voice. Use it." And she did. "I'm being held here without cause," she said, her voice steady, layered with decades not just of her life, but of her people's struggle. "Despite valid documents, despite proof of ownership, despite my name being on every legal file associated with that plane, these men decided I could not possibly be who I say I am." The words fell heavy in the night. Not sensational, not theatrical, just true. Caldwell stiffened, the red of the camera's record light making his authority feel smaller than he was used to. And that, perhaps, is the cruel irony of power. It grows soft when exposed to scrutiny. The real tension of the moment, the kind old black folks know by muscle memory, was not in the shouts or the handcuffs, but in the shift. The shift from being the accuser to being the accused. Because now the world was watching. And this world, even with its broken compass, sometimes recognizes when something ain't right. But don't mistake it. This wasn't a victory. No, this was proof. Proof that without the camera, her truth would have died on that runway. Proof that for black folks, it often takes witnesses to make the law behave. Proof that even in 2025, the burden of respect remains locked behind the lens of someone else's recognition. And oh, what a cost that is. Because what does it say about a country when your freedom depends not on your documents, your titles, or your accomplishments, but on whether someone is filming your humiliation? Behind her, Isaiah remained still. His silence wasn't submission, it was readiness. A kind of thunder waiting for the sky to split. Caldwell tried to interrupt. "This is a matter of federal verification, not public opinion." Caden didn't flinch. "Is it protocol to detain private citizens for hours without charge? Is it protocol to ignore evidence when it contradicts your assumptions?" Caldwell opened his mouth, then closed it. The script he knew was slipping. Meanwhile, Joel Chambers quietly handed Hill, the only officer whose eyes still held a trace of conscience, the final verification. Every line matched. Every field confirmed. Lenora's passport wasn't fraudulent. It had never been. She had been stopped not because her ID was faulty, but because their lens was. And now, as the camera captured the moment Hill read aloud the confirmation, Lenora watched Caldwell's face closely. There was no shame there. Only resentment. Resentment that the system hadn't bent far enough to protect his prejudice. But you see, this is the real war. Not between black and white, not even between citizen and state, but between the truth of who we are and the lies the world insists upon repeating. As Lenora turned back toward the camera, she didn't speak for herself alone. She spoke for the girl who gets called aggressive when she's simply assertive. For the father who gets pulled over for driving suspiciously. For the traveler who gets randomly selected every time. For the ones who never got their camera moment. This wasn't a scandal. It was a mirror. And America, if it dared to look, would see itself in full color, undeniable and unfinished. By dawn, the story was no longer just hers. It had unraveled from a quiet insult on the edge of a tarmac into a nationwide conversation, one ignited not by tragedy, but by the possibility of restraint. That, perhaps, is what made it even more dangerous. Dr. Lenora Hartwell had not wept, had not screamed. She had stood still, and that stillness, caught on camera, disturbed more than 1,000 headlines. The footage spread like fire across a field already too dry with suspicion. The sight of a black woman, respected, documented, dignified, being interrogated at her own plane, was not merely offensive. It was familiar. Familiar in the way an old wound is, never fully healed, always waiting for the next reopening. The country watched. And as always, it split in two. One side rallied, called for resignations, and posted hashtags like prayers. Hashtag I stand with Lenora, they typed. But hashtags do not protect you from handcuffs. Likes do not unmake trauma. And even solidarity, honest, urgent, and well-meaning, can feel like a strange kind of mourning. Because to be seen only when violated is to remain invisible all the same. The other side, the side built on denial, rose just as fast. She must have done something. This is standard. Why does everything have to be about race? Yes. The sacred American refusal. If I don't see it, it must not be real. But racism doesn't need your belief to exist. It only needs your silence. Caldwell, too, was watching. But he wasn't watching the news. He was watching himself disappear. Slowly, from the shield of anonymity to the glare of accountability. The department had put him on leave, pending review, the phrase they use when they want to buy time without buying guilt. But guilt has a scent. And it follows men like Caldwell long after the uniforms are gone. Within hours, more stories emerged. A black family in Chicago. A woman in Dallas. A student in Boston. All held, all questioned, all in moments that mirrored hers. Different names. Same sin. Caldwell's name echoed through them like a refrain. It became clear, Lenora's ordeal was not an accident. It was a pattern. And patterns, once revealed, indict not just individuals, but institutions. At her home in Los Angeles, Lenora sat before a laptop that would not stop chiming. Emails, requests, outrage, support, condemnation, interviews, donations, questions. And she just wanted quiet. But history does not grant quiet to those who stand at its crossroads. Isaiah brewed coffee in the next room. When he brought it to her, she looked up, tired but lucid. Feels like I didn't survive a moment, she said. I inherited a movement. He nodded. Sometimes that's how it begins. And there, in her own kitchen, she wept. Not because of fear or shame, but because of how much this country asks of its children when they are black and unbowed. She thought of Rosa, who sat down. Of Malcolm, who stood up. Of Baldwin, yes, him too, who wrote it all down when no one wanted to read. And she thought of herself, not as a symbol, but as a woman. Tired, brilliant, undeniably human. Yet, even in weariness, she knew this fight would not fade with the news cycle. For Caldwell was not the end, he was the example. And systems, when threatened, do not go quietly. They retrench. They regroup. They wait for memories to fade. But memory, for Black America, is not optional. It is survival. So as the sun burned through the smog and the city awakened to another day pretending it had changed, Lenora prepared herself. She would sue. She would speak. She would disrupt. Because somewhere, a little black girl was watching. And the story she told herself tomorrow would depend on the way Lenora answered today. What America fears most is not the flame, it is the spark. And by the time Dr. Lenora Hartwell stepped into that federal building, weeks after the night her existence was called into question, the spark had already spread. The press had cycled through it, polished it, clipped it into segments fit for prime time. But what remained untouched by makeup and sound bites was the truth that even power, when worn by a Black woman, is still seen as something to be verified. She entered the sterile conference room like one who had buried too many illusions to flinch. Across from her sat Director Elaine Curtin, a woman who had spent her life studying policy, not people. She wore an expression trained in decorum, one that said, "We regret the optics, but not the instinct." Beside Lenora sat Victoria Haynes, her lawyer, her friend, a mirror of calm steel. Dr. Hartwell, Director Curtin began, her voice even, rehearsed. "Let me first say we take this matter seriously." Lenora didn't blink. She had heard that tone before. It was the same one that followed her through the Ivy League, that visited her mother when the bank denied her a loan. It was the voice of institutions protecting themselves, not people. "What you take seriously," Lenora said, her voice low but unyielding, "is the story, not the soul." Curtains shifted. Victoria slid a folder across the table. "We're filing a formal civil rights complaint. Not just for the night in question, but for the pattern that your own data shows of Black and brown travelers disproportionately flagged for secondary screening, questioned longer, and treated with presumptive guilt." Curtin's eyes flicked down to the folder, but her voice pressed forward. "We're implementing new training protocols, bias education, additional safeguards." Lenora leaned in. "You don't fix a wound with a seminar. You fix it by changing the hand that holds the knife." There was silence then, not of peace, but of the unspoken truth floating in the room like smoke. The truth is that systems do not change because they want to. They change because they are forced to. That week, the footage from the airport played again, this time beside new clips, a TSA agent removing a Black child from a line, another agent interrogating a Sikh man as if his faith were contraband. They were not isolated events. They were a sequence. The protests followed. Not on fire. Not in fists. But in testimony. Elders who'd marched in Selma now stood on courthouse steps with smartphones and signs. Young activists, born long after Jim Crow had changed its clothes, carried placards that read, "We're not your random checks." And somewhere beneath it all, an old question stirred again, like a ghost that America keeps trying to forget. When will Black humanity be enough? Not Black excellence. Not Black obedience. Not Black entertainment. But simply Black existence, without apology, without suspicion, without delay. In the days that followed, Lenora's name was floated in rooms where policy was shaped. She was asked to consult, to advise, to lend her voice to the structure that had tried to mute her. And still, she wrestled with the weight of it. Because survival is not the same as justice. And victory, when won alone, can be just another kind of loneliness. She walked through her neighborhood one evening, no cameras, no headlines, just a woman in motion. And there, beneath the hum of streetlights, an elderly Black man nodded at her from his porch. He said nothing. He didn't need to. His nod said, "We saw what they did. And we saw what you did back." It was the same nod her grandfather had given the preacher when they integrated the school. The same nod her father offered the nurse who called him sir in a town that once spat on his shoes. It was the nod that says, "You lived through it. Now carry it forward." And she would. Because the spark had caught. And America, once again, stood in the flicker of its unfinished reckoning. There comes a moment, often quiet, often unannounced, when history folds in on itself and asks you, what will you do with the pain you did not choose, but were chosen to carry? Dr. Lenora Hartwell stood once again on the tarmac at JFK, months after the night she was stopped, questioned, and made to feel like a stranger to her own name. But this time, there were no flashlights in her face. No radio calls. no hands hovering near holsters. The process was seamless. Her documents were scanned. Her name was recognized, not only by the database, but by the posture of the agents. Respect, perhaps. Or fear. Or maybe the residue of exposure. Either way, the air had shifted. But let us not confuse civility with transformation. Because the scar is still there, beneath the concrete, beneath the badge, beneath the thin veneer of progress. Caldwell had been dismissed. Not for racism, no. That word was never uttered in the report. The system prefers softer synonyms: misconduct, failure to follow protocol, breakdown in procedure. They retired him quietly, as if history could be erased with a pension and a signature. But truth, real truth, doesn't retire. It festers until it is faced. Weeks earlier, Lenora had received a letter. Handwritten. From Officer Hill, the junior agent from that night. She confessed she had felt something was wrong, but fear had held her tongue. "I watched you being wronged," the letter read, "and I said nothing. I'm sorry. I want to do better." Lenora read it twice. Then again. It was not justice, but it was something almost as rare: remorse. And that, perhaps, is what this country must still learn. Justice is not just punishment, it is reflection. Reflection on how a nation can build monuments to freedom while erecting checkpoints for those who look like her. Reflection on how many dreams are buried not in cemeteries, but in the silence of random checks and just doing my job. Reflection on how a woman could create cures for disease, lift communities, speak in cities across the globe, and still be reduced, in seconds, to a suspect with skin. That night, after landing in Los Angeles, Lenora walked through her home. The walls, once a sanctuary, now carried the weight of a story far larger than any she had wanted to tell. Her father's photograph hung near the study. He had died before she bought the jet. But she imagined what he'd say now. Not congratulations. No pity. But something between warning and love. "Child, they will always test you, not for who you are, but for what they refuse to believe you could be." She whispered to his frame, "You were right. But I didn't break." Outside, across the country, her story continued to ripple. The class action suit moved forward. TSA began reevaluating its training modules. Journalists wrote think pieces, educators revised lesson plans, pastors folded her name into sermons. And yet, she remained steady. Not triumphant. Not bitter. Just clear. Because clarity, in the face of chaos, is a kind of revolution. One evening, she was invited to speak before a panel on systemic bias. The audience was older, veterans of marches and courtrooms, of back doors and bus protests. And when she finished, there was no applause. Only that long, full silence of recognition. An older black woman, her hair a crown of silver, approached after. She gripped Lenora's hand and said, "They tried to delay your flight, baby. But all they did was give you wings." Lenora smiled. Because the battle had never been just about the gate, or the badge, or the jet. It was about belonging, the most radical demand Black people have made on this soil. The right to belong. Without proving. Without apologizing. Without waiting. So she walked on, not because the road was easy, but because it was hers now. And somewhere in the distance, another child of color stepped into a line, head held high, carrying less fear and more future, because someone had already paid the toll. And the sky, wide and waiting, was finally beginning to open.